Okay, so we've talked about the male reproductive system. Let's talk about the female reproductive system. We'll start with an overview of the organs. First, you have the ovaries, the uterine or fallopian tubes, which are also called the oviducts. You have the uterus, the vagina, the vulva or pudendum, and the mammary glands, not mammillary glands, mammary glands. Sorry about that. All right, so here's a nice sagittal section of the female reproductive tract. Here you can see this nice big organ here. This would be the bladder. You have the bladder and the urethra. Notice the only thing coming through that urethra is going to be urine. Back here, you have the vagina. The vagina is this muscular canal leading back to the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus. Notice how the uterus kind of rests on top of the bladder. And then coming out from both sides, again, this is a sagittal section, so you kind of have to imagine going into the picture here. You see that fallopian tube or oviduct and the ovary itself. This is a frontal section, or actually a posterior section. Sorry, I was flipped around there. Posterior view of the female reproductive organs. You can see the vagina, this nice muscular cavity. You can see the cervix, which is this narrow opening to the uterus. You can see how thick this uterine wall is. And then these fallopian tubes or uterine tubes, which end in something called fimbriae. It's labeled over here. Fimbriae are these little kind of wisps of tissue. Notice the fallopian tube is not sucked on to the ovary. The ovary and the fallopian tubes are just kind of hovering next to each other. In fact, when the eggs are released from the ovaries once a month, this line here is just a ligament holding the ovary in place. When the eggs release, it's kind of sucked up like a vacuum into the fallopian tube. These fimbriae kind of wave back and forth, pulling the egg in. I just want to point out two more vocabulary words here. This inner lining of the uterus is a slightly different color than this muscular part, and that's because this inner lining is the part that is shed on a monthly cycle. This is called the endometrium. The endometrium is the lining of the uterus which grows and then is shed on a monthly cycle. And then you have your myometrium, which is the muscular layer. You may recall that prefix myo when we talked about the myocardium of the heart. So let's talk about the process of oogenesis, which is kind of a cool word, I think. This is the process of egg production. It occurs in the ovaries. The ovaries are those paired organs producing those secondary oocytes, which will eventually mature if they're fertilized. They release hormones, progesterone, estrogen, inhibin, which is the same hormone in males, and relaxin. This animation here goes through the process of oogenesis. Let's talk about the ligaments of the ovaries holding the ovaries in place. You have that ovarian ligament anchoring the ovaries to the uterus. There's also a suspensory ligament anchoring the ovaries to the pelvic wall, and then a broad ligament, which is kind of like a bat wing, attaching the ovaries to the uterus within a double-layered peritoneum. So the process of oocyte development really begins before the female child is even born. Oocytes are therefore not produced continuously like male spermatocytes. They do not mature until puberty. One oocyte develops each month from puberty until menopause. So let's talk about the uterine tubes, also called the fallopian tubes. They go laterally from either side of the uterus. There's the infundibulum, which is that funnel-shaped end close to the ovary. And then there's the fimbriae, which are the finger-like projections, which have this sweeping movements to kind of catch and direct that oocyte from the ovary into the uterine tube. These uterine tubes or fallopian tubes transport the oocyte into the uterus. The uterus itself is found between the bladder and the rectum. It's kind of an inverted pear shape. It's the site of implantation for the fertilized egg. It's the site of fetal development. If fertilization does not occur, it's also the source of the menstrual flow. There's a couple parts to the uterus. The fundus is the top part, or the most superior part. It's kind of the dome-shaped portion. There's the body, which is the tapering central portion. The cervix, which is the narrow portion opening into the vagina. The uterine cavity is the inside hollow part of the uterus, which could house a growing baby. The myometrium, as I mentioned, is that smooth muscle layer, and the endometrium is that mucous membrane layer responsible for nourishing the fetus, or which is shed each month if fertilization does not occur. Here you can see that same picture again. You see the endometrium, this lining, the myometrium. You can see the fundus. You can see the body, and then you see the cervix. The ovary, you can see this ovarian ligament. You can see the broad ligament. Is it labeled? I don't even see it being labeled. I'm not seeing the label, but this kind of bat wing-like structure on both sides is the broad ligament. And then you have the suspensory ligament here. Those are the three major ligaments holding those ovaries in place. Now we can talk about the vagina, found between the bladder and the rectum. It's the canal that extends from the exterior portion of the cervix of the uterus. It's the receptacle for the penis and the semen during sexual intercourse, and it's the outlet for menstrual flow. It's also the passageway for childbirth, the birth canal. The hymen is a special thin fold of membrane that partially covers the vaginal orifice. It usually breaks and bleeds during the first sexual intercourse. It can also break during sports or other physical activities. The lining of the mucosa has lots of stores of glycogen. The decomposition of the glycogen is going to produce an acidic environment to help slow any microbial growth. It's also harmful to sperm, but the semen combat that acidity with its alkaline pH. The perineum is the small diamond-shaped area between the thighs and buttocks in males and females. It contains the external genitals and the anus. The vulva are the specialized female external genitals. So this includes the mons pubis, which is the elevated adipose tissue on the ventral surface of the female. It's covered by pubic hair. It cushions the pubic symphysis. You also have the labia majora. This is two folds of skin extending down and back from the mons pubis, again covered in pubic hair. The development from the same embryonic tissue as the scrotum of the male. There's fatty adipose tissue. There's also sebaceous glands and sweat glands in this area as well. Then you have the labia minora containing sebaceous glands. These are two longitudinal folds medial to the labia majora. The clitoris is the cylindrical mass of erectile tissue and nerves, interior junction of the labia minora, and this is going to engorge and become erect during sexual stimulation. The vestibule is just the area between the labia minora. This is where the hymen, the vaginal opening, the urethral opening is. There's special glands called vestibular glands in this area secreting mucus during sexual arousal, intercourse, that add to cervical mucus to provide lubrication. Here you can see the inferior view of the structure. You can see the hymen, this kind of extra fold. You can see the labia minora, labia majora, the clitoris here, and the mons pubis is the fatty tissue. Let's talk about breasts. They're superior to and attached to the pectoralis major. So they're on top of the muscles and the serratus anterior muscles. They're connected to those underlying structures, of course, by connective tissue. There's the nipple. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with these structures. It's the pigmented projection. There's lots of spaces where milk is secreted. If you've never lactated before, you probably don't realize that your nipple actually has several holes on it. So when you do lactate, if you're female and you plan on lactating at some point in your life after you have a child, you'll know that milk doesn't just come out of one small hole at the tip of your nipple. It actually comes out from all directions, from all over that nipple, which is kind of a weird thing at first. The areola is the circular pigmented area around the nipple, and it has modified oil glands in that area, and they have the oil secreted from those glands have a scent, supposedly to help the newborn baby kind of find and identify their mother. The mammary glands are inside the breast. They're considered part of the reproductive system. They're actually modified sweat glands. They develop during puberty. They change when a female is pregnant to begin producing milk. They contain 15 to 20 lobes arranged in kind of a circular radial pattern. It's all separated by lots of fatty adipose tissue and connective tissue. special suspensory ligaments in there as well for support. And of course, after females have a baby and produce milk, those suspensory ligaments are nice and stretched out, which is why several women, after they have children and lactate, decide to get breast augmentations, because they're just not the same as they used to be. The lobules, which are within the lobes, contain those special milk-secreting alveoli, which all drain towards the nipple. Here you can see what I mean. You have these special suspensory ligaments in there holding everything in place. You can imagine after these milk ducts kind of fill and engorge with lots and lots and lots of milk, the breast increase in size dramatically. These suspensory ligaments get very, very stretched out. The milk is going to drain from these lobules through the ducts down into the nipple. This doesn't really give a good representation of all of the different spouts, so to speak, from the nipple, but there's several holes that the milk will come out. Let's talk about the process of egg formation, oogenesis. We'll go into some detail here. So oogonia are the equivalent to spermatogonia. These are the progenitors, or kind of stem cells, to those primary oocytes. Those primary oocytes begin meiosis during fetal development. They complete meiosis at puberty. There's 200,000 to 2 million in every ovary at birth. When a female reaches puberty, about only 40,000 are going to remain, and around 400 are going to mature during reproductive lifetime. So in other words, a female can kind of guess that they're going to menstruate about 400 times in their life, which is kind of an overwhelming idea. Of course, that depends on how often you're pregnant and birth control, etc., etc., but that's the general idea. So in other words, all 2 million eggs, or primary oocytes, I should say, that you're born with, if you're female, do not stay there your entire life. They eventually get reabsorbed and die, so the 400 best are released throughout your life. So let's talk about the ovary. The ovary has this germinal epithelial covering the surface of the ovary, and then inside is the cortex. The cortex contains the ovarian follicles. Ovarian follicles are little sac-like structures that contain the oocyte and all of the supporting cells to nourish the oocyte, as well as secreting estrogens. There's the primordial follicle, which is that first follicular stage, and then there's a Graafian follicle, which is a mature follicle stage. This is a large fluid-filled follicle that ruptures and expels the secondary oocyte. It literally looks like a big zit on the surface of the ovary. Kind of a gross idea. But it kind of pops out that secondary oocyte, which is sucked up by the fimbriae of the uterine tube and then travels down towards the uterus. When that oocyte is ejected, that is the process of ovulation. Ovulation is the process of ejecting that oocyte from the ovary into the uterine tubes. The corpus luteum literally translates to the yellow body. This is what's left of the ovulated follicle. So after the zit pops, so to speak, and the egg travels down the uterine tube, that kind of empty shell that was left on the ovary rather is called the corpus luteum. If pregnancy occurs, it's going to release progesterone, estrogens, relaxin, inhibin, kind of preps your body for pregnancy. If pregnancy doesn't occur, it withers away, and you would never know that it existed. Eventually, even with pregnancy, it degenerates and becomes a fibrous tissue, kind of like a scar almost. So here you see the process of follicular development. You have all of these primary oocytes, which develop into secondary oocytes, or secondary follicles, I should say, and then they grow. So at any given time in a female ovary, they could have a number of growing follicles, and each month one gets large enough to pop, as I said. And here you see this process of ovulation. This follicle gets very, very big. You can see that oocyte inside of it. It's nice and mature, and all of these special cells there helping it to mature. It's released, and this empty shell, this ruptured follicle, kind of withers away and turns into this structure called the corpus luteum. So let's go ahead and talk about the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is different from the uterine cycle. So the ovarian cycle is from follicular development to until corpus luteum development. This is occurring once a month, and it does involve hormones. Hormones from the hypothalamus, including GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, as well as LH and FSH, the same two anterior pituitary hormones that influence sperm production in males. So, the ovarian cycle is the process of oogenesis. Oogenesis has the meiosis step to generate the secondary oocyte. The other cell that's produced is called a polar body. It's basically a packet of discarded nuclear material. It's an empty shell with some DNA in it. If that secondary oocyte is not fertilized, it deteriorates. Meiosis is not completed. If that secondary oocyte is fertilized, meiosis 2 is completed, and ovum is produced, as well as another polar body. The ovum and sperm chromosomes together then produce a diploid cell. So here you see the ovarian cycle. The ovarian cycle is kind of another term for egg maturation, the final steps. So here you see your oogonium. This is all during the fetal period, before the baby girl is even born. Meiosis continues, and it rests in primary oocyte. In prophase 1 of meiosis, baby girls are born with 40,000 or so of these. During childhood, none of those follicles development. Once puberty onsets, these primary follicles begin to develop, and you can see here, primary follicle is going to eventually turn into a secondary oocyte, in this case, releasing the first polar body from the first cell division. Once ovulation occurs, if the sperm fertilizes the secondary oocyte, meiosis 2 is completed. So meiosis 2 is not completed unless the sperm fertilizes the egg, in which case you get another polar body forming, and then your final diploid zygote is formed after ovulation. The menstrual cycle or uterine cycle is when that ovum is created. The follicles and corpus luteum secrete the hormones estrogen, progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin. There's a series of negative feedback loops to the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, causing lining changes in the uterus, thickening, transforming, ultimately to prepare for the embryo to implant. If no fertilization occurs, hormone levels drop, the lining is sloughed off. So the female reproductive cycle includes that maturation of the oocyte, oogenesis, and that uterine cycle, the thickening of that uterine lining. There's a follicular phase to the reproductive cycle and a luteal phase to the reproductive cycle. The follicular phase is when the body's preparing for ovulation, preparing for fertilization, preparing for the possibility of pregnancy. This is days 1 through 5 of your menstrual cycle. So these are the days that you're actually bleeding if you're female. Then you have the pre-ovulatory phase, which is the next week or so after you menstruate. Then your body goes through the luteal phase. The luteal phase is the phase where your body's trying to support a pregnancy or leads to menses if fertilization didn't occur. So ovulation is the first day of your luteal phase. Luteal referring to the corpus luteum, which was left over after ovulation occurred. And then you get that post-ovulatory phase, which is days 15 to 28 until you menstruate again, where that uterine lining is building and building and building, preparing for that fertilized egg to appear in the uterus. If it doesn't, then you go into the menstrual phase, and then the pre-ovulatory phase, and then ovulation, and post-ovulatory phase. So let's talk about this menstrual phase. This is the first few days of your uterine, of the female reproductive cycle. Your follicles are growing within the ovaries. The uterus, the arteries themselves are going to constrict because there's declining levels of estrogen and progesterone. The endometrial cells begin to die. Loss of blood, loss of tissues from the endometrium, all passing through the cervix and the vagina. After the menstrual phase is over, days 6 to 13, that within the ovary, FSH is going to promote the follicular growth, secreting lots of estrogen, lots of inhibin. So in other words, estrogen levels are going to rise now. Somewhere around day 6, one of those follicles is larger and healthier than all of the others and begins to turn into that Graafian follicle. It's going to enlarge because of LH, luteinizing hormone, is now being released. The uterus itself is when those endometrial glands are beginning to develop. The arterioles are going to begin to lengthen, growing that endometrial lining, regenerating that endometrial lining. Day 14 is ovulation. That Graafian follicle ruptures, releasing that oocyte into the pelvic cavity, into the uterine tube. At this point, you have high levels of estrogen, initiating gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and luteinizing hormone for the release of ovulation. Once the egg is released, you're in the post-ovulatory phase. Your ovary is going to continue to develop that corpus luteum if the presence of LH is there, luteinizing hormone. The corpus luteum secretes progesterone, estrogen, relaxin, and inhibin. If no fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate after 2 weeks. Your GnRH, FSH, and LH are going to rise. The new ovarian cycle is going to begin. If fertilization does occur, that fertilized oocyte begins to divide, mitosis begins to occur, HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, is produced by that hormone about 8 days after fertilization, and that's going to tell the corpus luteum not to degenerate. HCG is the hormone that's detected on your pregnancy tests. The post-ovulatory phase, your uterus is going to begin to, again, proliferate with the growth of endometrial glands. Glycogen is being secreted, lots of vascularization, lots of thickening of the endometrium. It's going to peak about 1 week after ovulation in preparation for that fertilized ovum. So here you see high levels of estrogen from the ovary being produced. That's going to send a feedback loop up to the hypothalamus for GnRH and LH to be released. LH is going to be released. That's going to trigger ovulation. Ovulation will then release that secondary oocyte, and then the corpus luteum is now going to either support the pregnancy if it gets that HCG hormone from the fertilized egg. Here you see this is probably the most useful diagram of the female reproductive cycle. You can see all the hormones, what's going on in the ovary, and what's going on in the uterus. So at the very beginning, you have menstruation, as I mentioned, the shedding of the lining that goes up until day 5 or so. What's happening at that point? FSH is stimulating these follicles to grow, saying, okay, well, fertilization didn't occur last month, but let's have another go at it. Let's make sure that we're growing a nice big Graafian follicle. So estrogen levels begin to increase after menstruation occurs. Estrogen levels increase. Eventually, at about day 14, LH is going to be released. LH is going to signal the rupturing of that follicle, in other words, ovulation. That secondary oocyte is released, and now we get more LH being released from our anterior pituitary, telling our corpus luteum to grow, 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 as lots and lots of progesterone and estrogens are being released, telling our uterine lining to thicken, thicken, thicken. Look how thick it gets here. And then if fertilization doesn't occur, the corpus luteum shrivels away and menstruation occurs again. So, changes in concentrations of the anterior pituitary and ovarian hormones throughout the cycle. If we look during menstruation up to day 5, all of our levels are relatively low. After menstruation, estrogen levels rise. Right before ovulation, you have an increase in LH, a surge in LH. You also have your follicular stimulating hormone, FSH, being released in higher amounts at this point also. Your luteinizing hormone decreases after ovulation, estrogen decreases after ovulation, but because that corpus luteum is left over, progesterone levels increase. Progesterone is the hormone that's going to help maintain a pregnancy, help with implantation, and progesterone is the main hormone released from that corpus luteum. So this animation here goes through the hormonal control of the female reproductive cycle. Let's stop here for part